yourself at the desk right outside this library. Um, and if anyone would like a translation from Kannada to English or vice versa, we have our translator Guru Kiran over here, and you can sit next to him for the same. Um, I welcome you all, and shall I introduce the panelists and the moderator? Okay, I invite Jayna Kothari, Senior Advocate practicing at the Supreme Court and the Executive Director of CLPR, to please take the stage, along with Dr. Aqsa Shaikh, Associate Professor at Hamdard Institute of Medical Science and Research, Vihaan Peethambar, Diversity, Equity and Inclusion Professional and Trans Activist, Dr. Aparna Chandra, Associate Professor of Law, National Law School of India University. I welcome you all.
Hello? Yeah. Welcome, everyone. I think this is a very exciting roundtable that we have this morning. Questions of reproductive justice within the transgender rights movement. CLPR has been working extensively on reproductive rights, and we really wanted to explore why issues around reproductive rights were not raised within the transgender rights movement prominently. The impetus we got for this panel was really from one of the speakers, Sujitha, who's not here. We hope she'll join us midway. And Sujitha contacted us in raising issues of reproductive and bodily autonomy and how that was not being addressed by medical practitioners whose work is often steeped in ideas of marriage and procreation as being non-negotiable for women. This got us to explore issues of reproductive health and justice within the transgender rights framework. Often we see, even within the trans movement, reproductive and sexual rights of trans men are even more further ignored. And we wanted to raise that as well. If we kind of move a little out of India and we see what is happening around the world, we find that in many states in the US, for example, the requirement for change of gender identity includes giving up reproductive capacities or sterilization. That is still a requirement in many countries for change of gender identity. Of a different, if you want to adopt a different gender identity. In some more progressive countries where there are more progressive gender identity laws, such as Argentina, they are not required to give up their reproductive capacities. But we still find that in many jurisdictions, you either have to choose between your right to gender identity or your reproductive rights. And that is a serious issue. And we need to address that. I think the issues around, and so there is still a complete absence of the existence of sexual and reproductive rights within our health policies and our laws as well. If we talk about the right to gender identity does not say anything about how one chooses either their sexual or romantic companion, their sexual practices, or about their reproductive choices and capacities. It doesn't say anything, and it shouldn't make one give up those rights, right? But we don't have any legal recognition, or we don't even have a conversation around these issues. And I think really in this panel, we have an amazing set of speakers from different backgrounds, from the law, from the medical background, and from community work. And we hope that we can take an approach to issues of reproductive rights within the trans community that would have a positive imagination about the reproductive capacities and desires of trans people, that would dismantle some existing notions around pregnancy and womanhood, whatever that means, and would look at broader conceptions of reproductive justice and what that would mean within the transgender rights movement. So I welcome all of you. Really looking forward to it. Our first speaker would be Dr. Aqsa Shaikh. And what we'll do is we'll take 20 minutes. We have a little more time because I think Sujitha may not be here. So I will keep the time for 20 minutes and then we can open the floor for questions.
I'll use a presentation. Sure. Being the boring teacher. No, you can sit next to Jayna maybe. Hello, good morning. How are you guys doing? You had a nice night, all of you? Yeah. Jay, you didn't have. Jay, right? Okay. So today we'll be talking about a very interesting thing, that's right to love and right to procreate and right to reproduce and bring in this world a part of you. And I'll be also touching about the sexual and reproductive health of queer persons, and touching upon areas which are generally not discussed either in the communities conversations on health or even in the medical setup. So it's going to be a little educative also, since there are so many community members, and I want to also use this opportunity that this message then further spreads into the communities, especially those who are not that privileged with the medical knowledge. Mihir, can we have the next one? Yeah. So I want to start with this very powerful statement, which I read, that the desire to have children is not attached to gender. It's not even attached to sex. It's just being part of a human being, and I wouldn't say it's not just human being. Even animals and other species want to have children, or whatever you call it. So when, however, we have conversations about gender identity or sexual orientation, and with reference to the trans or queer communities, reproduction is something which is which always takes the backseat, because it's considered that gay persons won't have children, or trans people to उनको तो बच्चे कैसे हो सकते हैं, वो तो बच्चे kidnap करते हैं. So that's the conversation which the mainstream society has generally. Next one. So when it comes to the queer and trans bodies, we are generally mysteries. So we are either converted into very divine beings, just like how disabled persons are now Divyangjan. Divyangjan, right? Is that the word that a prime minister has used? And sometimes you are subhuman, So many times doctors, including, consider that trans and queer persons are asexual. That trans people, how can they have sex? I mean, aren't their genitalia not fashioned in such a way that they can't have the penetrative sex, right? And therefore they are non-reproductive. So even when we look at the Transgender Persons Protection of Rights Act, it's completely silent on the issue of marriage, surrogacy, adoption, having children, rights of children. It only talks about custody, so that's the kind of language which the law is using. On the other hand, we sometimes see that the trans bodies and intersex bodies and queer bodies are considered to be hypersexual, to the extent that we start using the word perversion. So if you look at the forensic medicine and toxicology textbooks, and look at the descriptions of lesbian and gay persons over there, they would be considered to be hypersexual perverts, and those are the kind of words that have been used. And it's like some kind of a psychological derangement, and that is the kind of perception you have. So if you come out in a medical school and say that you are a trans person, you will be assumed to be a pervert, and other people will stay away from you, because that's the language which is there in the textbook, which they are supposed to remember and then say that to their examiners to score marks and pass and become good doctors. And I specifically mentioned two acts over here, the NSCP and the Trans Act, which basically reduce us to our bodies. Even in the National AIDS Control Program, it's been the pioneer when it comes to the dialogue around trans persons. And that's the first time any government body started speaking about MSM and trans persons. But then what is the context? The context is HIV. Everywhere you look at the NACO documents, it says that MSM and trans people are the ones who have the highest prevalence of HIV, sometimes touching 50%. And I think, as Sayan was mentioning yesterday, once you say that someone is HIV positive, it's assumed that they are sexually active, and not just sexually active, but are having multiple sexual partners and unprotected sex. They are irresponsible. They do not know how to take care of themselves. And these are the kind of judgments which come with the diagnosis of HIV. So when you are saying that a particular community has one of the highest prevalence of HIV, you are also painting that community as someone which is hypersexual, sexually irresponsible, not capable of making decisions, and therefore needs disciplining. When we come to the Trans Act, it is also reducing us to our bodies. So to be a male or a female, and get that certificate, you have to undergo some kind of a surgical intervention. Without that, you can't be a male and female. I sometimes wonder, if a woman undergoes mastectomy or hysterectomy, will you take away the woman's certificate which was issued to her at birth, because she does not have a uterus and breast, which you want a trans woman to have before you can issue her women's identity card? Or if a man has testicular cancer and gets the testis removed, he no longer continues to be a man. Will the marriage be dissolved? I mean, these are the kind of questions that we really need to ask these lawmakers. So it's all reducing us to our bodies, and not even talking of sex and reproduction in the same acts. Next one, Mihir. When it comes to the intersex bodies, though we are talking about mostly trans persons in this conference, I mean, let's not forget about the intersex persons, which are a very invisible part of our community, and which unfortunately has been clubbed with the transgender persons in the Trans Act. So when we legally speak about transgender persons in India, it includes trans persons and also intersex persons. And in the intersex persons, there has been this constant question of what is normal. Just to give an example, what is the normal length of penis and what is the normal length of clitoris is the question that the doctors are, dealing with. And if a clitoris is long, then how long is the clitoris? And then you cut it so that it becomes normal. So these are the questions that the intersex bodies face. And the consequences are that then the parents and the doctors decide to have unnecessary surgeries on intersex children, which can scar them for lives. We talk so much about female genital mutilation being practiced by in the African communities, but we don't talk about the genital mutilating surgeries which are being performed in the disguise of helping these intersex children by their own parents and caring doctors. So when it comes to the intersex persons, a very important question is who decides what will be the body of this intersex person, and what is this normal body where you want to fix in, because the parents want to avoid that discomfort of telling people that as soon as you hear good news, कि किसी को बच्चा हुआ, you ask क्या हुआ, लड़का हुआ या लड़की. So I've made this principle that now anyone, they tell me that they've been blessed with a child, I just ask them if the child is healthy, if the mother and if the child is doing good. But stop asking whether it's a male child or a female child to get a boy or a girl. That puts the pressure on the parents to tell the society, to get a birth certificate, because currently our birth certificates do not have the provision of writing intersex in it. In the schools, there is no provision of writing intersex. The only option available is transgender, and intersex children are not necessarily transgender, and you don't know if they're transgender at the age of 3 years. I mean, they may be still exploring and discovering their gender identity at that time. So it's very important that we have this dialogue and conversation on who decides. Do the parents have the right to decide and perform these surgeries on the children? Do the doctors have the right to decide whether this child should be reared as a male child or as a female child? Or should we wait for the child to grow up, discover their gender identity, And then in the long run, maybe when they're able to take that decision, or maybe even wait till 18 years if it's not a life threatening condition, and then let them decide what kind of a body they want. Why do the parents have that right? No, they don't. Parents are not Bhagwan. Let's get away from that concept for once and all. They have the right to give consent when it is for the betterment of the children and for the care of the children when the children are diseased. But intersex children are not people with disease, and therefore it's not a consent for a procedure which is going to cure or care for the child. It's a cosmetic surgery that you're getting performed so that you can declare that you have a boy or a girl. And most often people convert the intersex children into boys because that's going to be the chirag of the khandan, right? Next one. When it comes to the trans and the intersex persons, this is a very important confabulation which happens, and we need to understand that there are different needs. In the trans communities, we have been fighting for allowing providing care to trans adolescents and children, to give them puberty blockers or puberty delayers so that they can take their time and delay their puberty and later on decide whether they want to undergo transition or they want to continue with their natural puberty process. Unfortunately, it is not allowed in India right now, administering puberty blockers to transgender children. But at the same time, we need to understand that while this is something which is going to help trans children take decision later, the procedures that we do on intersex children without their consent are permanent, and they can be life threatening also, that they can permanently mutilate and therefore take away from them the joy and pleasure of having sex later, for example. So these are two important things, that when we are dealing with the trans children, it's about their life. It's very important to do that. And when it comes to the intersex children, the principal should be taking a back step and allowing the child to decide. And the medical community needs to come to terms with that. That when it comes to trans children, help them through puberty blockers. When it comes to intersex children, no intervention is the best intervention unless it's life-threatening, which is very rare. Next, please. Now, this is something which most of us have been talking about since yesterday, but I just wanted to highlight that this denial of reproductive rights in our laws, and I'm sure the my other panelists will be speaking more on it. So, marriage, adoption, surrogacy, ART, MTP, these are the things where our rights are not there. But one important point which generally does not become part of a conversation is cancer screenings. Cancer is the second most deadly disease that we Indians deal with, and screening could be a way of decreasing mortality, improving your quality of life. But this is being denied to trans persons officially because none of our national guidelines on cancer screening talk about trans or intersex or gender non-binary persons. Next one. So I'll be just highlighting. So yesterday Swati was saying that the marriage provisions, does not speak about biological man or woman. But this is coming from the court statement from the highest legal representative of the government, who mentioned that the marriage is permissible only between biological man and woman. And therefore, this fight becomes now even more difficult when it comes to marriage between a trans person or between the same-sex couples. Next, I'll quickly go through these ones. When it comes to the abortion laws, it always uses the word woman. And I think Umi was mentioning this, that now with the Trans Act, you can easily get the transgender identity card. But if you want to get the woman's card, which was easier before the Trans Act, now you have to undergo a surgical procedure for it. I myself have not undergone bottom surgery, but I have a woman's identity card on all my markers because this was before the Trans Act. And I'm so fortunate. Had that been later, now I would have to prove to the magistrate that I've undergone surgery, and if it satisfies him, her, or them, only then I'll get that identity card. Next. When it comes to the surrogacy and assisted reproductive technology legislations, and the bills have been passed in both the houses 3 days back, and we are sure the president is going to sign on it. So it talks about a couple which is a legally married Indian man and woman. Previously, single people could also commission surrogacy. So you have the famous example of Karan Johar, who commissioned surrogacy, but now it's not possible for him because only it has to be a married couple who has been infertile for 5 years, and only then they can. And it's a very ageist document. All of these places, the elder people beyond the age of 55 or 60 are not allowed to even commission surrogacy. Next. We have the assisted reproductive technology, which says that the person using that technology has to be a couple, married man and woman, or has to be a woman. So single men are not allowed to use assisted reproductive technologies, and it's not allowed for the live-in couples, who the court says have the same rights as the married couples. In other things. And I'm specifically mentioned this statement which came from Dr. Hina Gavit, Member of Parliament, and the rationale given for why men are not allowed to commission surrogacy. So she mentions that in 2017, law says that single men can't adopt female child, which is the provision in your adoption guidelines. And this was done in consideration to a significant number of female children being exploited by them. I don't know where is the data that adoptive male parents exploit their daughters, and it's assuming that all the adoptive parents are cis het men. I mean, what if the adoptive parent is a gay man and then adopts a male child? Can they also potentially exploit that child? And then it says that since determining the sex of the child is not legal in India, even when you are commissioning ART, this makes single men ineligible, because then they can't choose only a male child. I mean, what if that turns out to be a female child? Then they can't have that child, and therefore we'll deny them the rights of having a child of their own. Next one. When it comes to the adoption, this is terrible that the legally eligible children for adoption are very few in India. That's one of the countries where there's actually a genuine need for a lot of adoption, and it says that it has to be a couple or a single female when it comes to adopting any gender, and males can adopt only. And it's very difficult for a single male to be approved for adoption. And this is something very interesting, and I want to talk about it, that to become an adoptive parent, you have to prove that you can be a good parent. Why is that not the condition for the other parents, who have their own biological children? Why don't we ask them that you please get a certificate of your mental, physical, emotional fitness before you can conceive? We never ask that, and nowadays people are suing their parents for having them. I'm sure you have heard of that, right? But yeah, when it comes to adoption, you have to prove that you can be a good parent. When it comes to having your own children, well, you can be a monster and have your own children. Next, please. So coming to the healthcare provisions, again, this is a conversation that we have been having for long as to what are the difficulties that trans intersex square persons have in the medical system, what are the reasons for that, what are the barriers. And while many of us have had very bad experiences, including myself, with the healthcare providers, there are some healthcare providers who genuinely want to help the community, who want to learn from the community, but their hands are tied because the laws don't allow them or restricts them really, in providing care for them. There are a lot of language barriers also which are present. So, and I want to also specifically talk about, since we're speaking of reproduction, in a state like Australia, where you have only 2 crore people as compared to 130 plus crore in India, they have registered 250 births by trans men. I wonder if we have even a single example from India, where a trans man has given birth. It would be news, I'm sure. So, and they have started training their physicians and gynecologists and midwives on gender neutral birthing terminologies, like chest feeding instead of breastfeeding, like calling them birthing person instead of mother or pregnant woman. um, in India, we don't have that conversation. We don't even, unfortunately, in India, we are still stuck at providing dignified labor room practices to cis het women. If you visit a labor room, I don't know how many of you have visited a labor room, um, but then physical violence takes place in the labor room. Women are slapped, they are abused, the abdomens are pushed, and this is what I witnessed myself as a medical student, and it was pathetic and it was normalized. it just seeps so much into them that they don't feel even bad about doing that. It's like the right thing to stand on the top of the abdomen of a woman and give a push so that the baby can come out faster. Unfortunately, we are still in those ages as compared to other places where, we are speaking about gender neutral terms and so on. Even when many people want to help, the another issue which they have are the infrastructural and the protocol barriers. They maybe as a person want to help you, but the institutes don't support them. You have nowadays very corporatization of the medical care with Fortis, Apollo, and all these hospitals coming, and they don't want to be known as the places where transgender persons come, because that would affect other clients. Just like some hotels won't allow you because they don't want to be seen as places where people from the hijra community also go, right? So these are the issues that they have. Then there are barriers in terms of writing the gender on the medical records, whether you put the legal name or the name which is there on the Aadhaar card. In terms of infrastructural barriers, like no gender neutral washrooms or wards being there, though it's present in the Trans Act that all hospitals should provide indoor and outdoor patients facilities to the trans persons. Next, please. I'll not be speaking much on menstruation. I'm sure my co-panelist will do that. So these are some of the places where healthcare provisions interact with us and discriminate against us, like cancer screenings, PrEP, PEP, contraception, and so on. Next. Next, please. So when it comes to menstruation, I'll give it to my co-panelist, who's a trans man, to speak more on it, on what are the challenges. But then it's something which is considered to be a women's thing, and unfortunately dealt with by gynecologists who are now mostly women. And this is a phenomenon which has happened in India, that now only women take up gynecology and men are afraid to take gynecology. Whereas 20 or 25 years back, nearly 50% of gynecologists in India were men. So I don't know what has happened in these. Maybe we need an anthropological study on this as to why now men are not taking up gynecology. And it has really become only a women's world over there. Next. So when it comes to breast cancer screening, as I said, it's also going to be a little educative, because I also want you to understand need for your own bodies and also take these messages to people who are not part of this conference. So when it comes to breast cancer screening amongst the trans men, remember, if the trans men have not undergone a chest reconstruction surgery and they have the breast, then they have the same risk of breast cancer as cis-het women, and they should undergo a breast cancer's annual mammography after the age of 50 years till the age of 65. And if they are taking testosterone, then that decreases the risk of breast cancer. So but we don't have good enough studies to say whether it decreases to the risk that you don't require screening. And even if you have undergone a chest reconstruction surgery, remember this, that they cannot remove 100% of the breast tissue. And even if some breast tissue is there, it can turn cancerous, and therefore ideally you should undergo remember this, that breasts are not only present in men, but women, but also in men. So cis-het men also get breast cancer, and they should also undergo screening. Yeah, next. So when it comes to the cervical cancer screening, I'm sure most of the cis-het women are familiar with the pap smear test, which is being done every 3 years after the age of 21 years till the age of 65, or till you decide that, okay, now I've done enough of my health. So many of the trans men do not undergo a bottom surgery, or kind of what we call as a hysterectomy, in which the cervix is also removed. And if there is a cervix, there can be a cervical cancer. So all trans men who have cervix should undergo pap smear screening also. Next. When it comes to the prostate cancer screening, now this is for trans women. So even if you undergo some kind of a genital reconstruction surgery, remember this, that only the testes are removed and not the prostate. So if you have a prostate, you are likely to get prostate cancer. Of course, when you use anti-androgens, or if you use 5-alpha reductase drugs, then that decreases your risk of prostate cancer, because it shrinks the prostate but does not take away it completely. And therefore, annual prostate cancer screening is required after the age of 60 years. Next. when it comes to HIV prevention in trans people, this has been spoken a lot, so I think I'll skip this. But remember this, that irrespective of the kind of sex you have, even if it's a sex between two lesbian women, there is a risk of HIV transmission, and you therefore take precautions. Next. I think it's very important that now NACO introduces PrEP and PEP, especially for the key populations, including MSM and trans persons. And PrEP is something pre-exposure prophylaxis in terms of you take ART drugs or antiretrovirals before you get HIV, right? Or before you get exposed to an HIV positive person. So whenever you think you are likely to be in situations where you have more unprotected sex or where the barrier is likely to fail, in those situations you can start taking PrEP, and you can take it for as long as you want, and then you can stop it also, unlike ART, which once started cannot be stopped. This is available with some private providers in India, including some of the health based NGOs, but not part of the government setup. And this is what we need to advocate. So I think one of the advocacies out of this conference could be advocating for PrEP for the key populations. Next. Similarly, when it comes to post-exposure prophylaxis, this is something which is reserved for the healthcare workers. Currently in our guidelines, only healthcare workers who come across an HIV-infected person's exposure are supposed to get PrEP. But then it's important that we also provide this to the key populations at least, and then later on to everyone in the general population. So what is PrEP? Is basically post-exposure prophylaxis. So suppose you had an unprotected sex and you know that that person is HIV positive or any other form of exposure, then you take antiretroviral drugs for 4 weeks. And that drastically decreases the chance of contracting HIV. Next. Then when it comes to treatment of STI, remember that whatever form of sex you are having, you can get STIs. You can also get STIs even after using condoms, because they only cover the genitalia and not the skin. And when it comes to STI, you can also have skin to skin transmitted STI. You can have mucosa to mucosa transmitted STI. So take care of that aspect. And when it comes to key population, the current NACO guidelines mention that you should take these antibiotics every 3 months. But unfortunately, the knowledge of this with our sex workers kin is very, very less. So this needs to be propagated more so that they can take advantage of this guideline in NACO. Next, please. This is something very important, that when it comes to contraception, this is what we'll have to demand, because the healthcare workers considered that you are asexual beings. You are not capable of producing, and therefore, why would a trans woman or man need contraception? I mean, aren't they infertile because of the HRT which they are taking, or they must have undergone some form of surgery, and they must be infertile kind of person. So remember this, that HRT does not necessarily make you infertile. Even if you are on testosterone, even if you are on anti-androgens or estrogen, you may still be fertile and therefore need contraception. Also, it's wrong to assume that all trans persons are cis. We have a lot of trans persons, for example, trans women who are lesbians and trans men who are gay, and they may have a penetrative sex. And therefore, it's important to also educate your friendly healthcare workers that trans persons do need contraception. So talk about that. Ask them if they have a need of knowledge of contraceptive methods, or if they need any contraceptive methods. So this is a conversation that we'll have to start with the healthcare workers. Next. So I'll summarize with what actions is needed. So definitely we all agree that we need to reform medical education, but let's not lose our focus on reforming other educations also. Generally, our focus is only on legal and medical education. You know, I was discussing with Kanmani yesterday that why not fashion designing also need reform. When it comes to designing clothes for trans persons, or lingerie or footwear for trans persons. Why the chartered accountants don't need to reform? Because aren't our taxes also for males and females separate, slabs being present? So we need reform everywhere, and not just in the schools, law colleges or medical or nursing colleges. We need to amend the existing laws. We need to keep making noise that the surrogacy bill and the ART bill and the Trans Act do not provide for the reproductive justice for the trans persons, and they need change. Until unless we demand that, they are not going to change. Second is the guidelines have to become trans inclusive everywhere, including, for example, the cancer screening guidelines. Next, please. Uh, we need to demand for changes in the pattern of birth certification. Right now, within 21 days of birth, one has to register. And during that time, you can't really decide, for example, and whether an intersex child is a male child or a female child. How do they register? Many a times they register as a male child in that case, so we need to demand that there should be a provision for intersex children in the birth certificates also. This is very important, and some work on this has been done by Safe Access, that is demanding dual records, especially in the healthcare setup. So suppose if I go as a trans woman to a healthcare setup and they don't know that I have a prostate, how are they going to offer me prostate cancer screening? So we ask for dual records where your sex, biological sex is mentioned, and your gender is also mentioned, so that the healthcare worker knows what kind of anatomy you may have. But again, it's very difficult to assume your anatomy, and therefore next we also talk about an body checklist or an organ checklist. Like, do you have an ovary, do you have a uterus, do you have a prostate? And then accordingly the services will be provided to you. It's very important to tell our providers that sex and gender are different, and therefore do not confabulate between them. That gender identity and sexual orientation are different stuff, so don't assume that all trans persons are heterosexual. Next, and this should be my last slide, which says that it's very important to reiterate that all trans people are neither asexual nor hypersexual. And who gets to define what is hypersexual? What may be hypersexual for you may be normal for me. Also, trans people may want to marry, they may want to have the biological children, and the medical sciences need to help them with that. That's the right of their clients. And the trans people may also need contraception, and therefore we need those kind of conversations in our healthcare setup, and not just around gender affirmation surgery. Yeah, that should be the last slide. And this is the message that is there for all the healthcare workers, and which we can take it to them, that ask, don't assume. Ask me about my body, ask me about what I want, and ask me about what are my aspirations. Don't just assume that. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Aqsa. That was truly an amazing presentation and really quite educative on so many fronts. And I mean, I certainly speak for myself, but also for the audience, because you really expanded the scope of thinking about sexual and reproductive rights and all the issues that could be covered within it, including screenings and the issues relating to intersex persons, which of course we want to address in this conference as well. But how do you look at IGM as a form of, sexual and reproductive health violation, and specific issues concerning trans men as well within health screening? So really, thank you for that. I'd like to now go on to Vihaan.
Hello, hi. Good morning, everyone. First of all, thank you for the opportunity, Jayna, and for having me back at Transform this year. I'd just like to start my talk by saying that those who are transgender are not a monolithic population, right? And hence people from this community have different needs. They have, they experience barriers in many ways, and their levels of access to healthcare are hence very different, right? So what I'm going to speak about today is specifically on the challenges faced by trans masculine people, which restricts them from exercising their sexual and reproductive rights, right? So many of us are aware that a major criticism of the Transgender Act is that although it states the right to a self-perceived identity, it still mandates some form of medical intervention for us to be legally recognized as man or woman, right? Now, it is crucial to note that the set of rules that came later, Rule 6 specifically mentions that uses the term medical intervention to include all sorts of gender affirming or any gender affirming medical intervention, which includes, which an individual undertakes to facilitate the transition to their self-identified gender, which includes but is not limited to counseling, hormone therapy, and surgical intervention, if any. Right now, what the act has done is it has broadened the ambit of this provision. However, even today, we face challenges because the government officials who are involved in this process often ask for proof of surgery in order to legally recognize us as man and woman, and don't really understand what gender affirming medical intervention involves, right? Because for everyone, sex and gender are the same, which means if you're a man, you need to have a penis, right? Now, I want all of us to think about the implications of this when it comes to the sexual and reproductive capacities of a trans masculine person, right? This means that although both the right to gender identity and the right to sexual and reproductive health care are basic human rights, for a lot of trans masculine people, we can't have both at the same time, right? We have to choose between one or the other. Now, in 2018, when I took part in Transform, I spoke of the many challenges that I faced when I dealt with government officials in Kerala, where I'm from, to change my gender markers on my legal identification documents, right? So it was a year after the launch of the Kerala transgender policy, a core essence of which highlighted the right to self-identification, right? Which means that any person can legally identify as a man, woman, or transgender, and does not need any medical intervention, and does not need to show any proof of surgery to change our identification markers, right? Now, I went through a 6-month ordeal, which involved a lot of physical and mental harassment from the state to change my gender markers. I was made to strip at multiple hospitals, show my bare body. I was put through invasive ultrasound scans at multiple times to produce medical board certificates from government hospitals to prove my gender. Right now, I'm someone who loves kids, and I would have loved to have the option of have a child of my own. But at that point, I didn't know this was an option for me. Who wanted to live my truth openly, for me, who wanted some relief in some shape or form from the dysphoria that I constantly felt every day, I didn't know this was an option. And this is still today not an option for a lot of transmasculine persons, for where our legal recognition of our gender identity is still tied into hormonal and surgical compromises, either by law or by government officials who whose mercy we are at, and often require proof of surgery for us to be legally recognized, right? Now, even if, for example, transmasculine persons did not need to give up their legal recognition for their, did not need to give up on their sexual or reproductive capacities to be legally recognized as men, there are still many, many obstacles which restrict us from exercising these rights, right? Uh, for a beginning, the Indian healthcare system is not gender inclusive, right? Gendered healthcare spaces and individual providers are ill-equipped to deal with the requirements of, or the unique healthcare needs of transmasculine persons. Um, Now, this is a fact that our healthcare system or the reproductive healthcare system is historically centered around cisgender women, right? And this is a result, I would say this is a result of cis normative societal structures that reinforce, binary reproductive norms as an expectation, right? For instance, men don't have a uterus, hence men cannot get pregnant, hence men should not even desire to get pregnant, right? And now this translates into psychological concerns as well, right? For many transmasculine persons, the need to be acknowledged, to be seen, to be addressed as a man, and hence with the consistent usage of our chosen name and pronouns, is crucial for our emotional well-being and safety. So even if, so for many trans masculine persons, even if they were to go the route of having their own child, they would not want it to be broadly known, right? Broadly known by others. They would rather just want to keep that news to their closest loved ones and their medical providers, which in its current scenario in a country like India would be nearly impossible. I think it would be the cover page story of all the newspapers. Should a I mean, Aqsa did mention that they didn't know if there was a trans man who's had their child in India, right? Now I'd like to substantiate some of these things with experiences, right? um, I've read an interview of a trans man, and this is an interview of someone from abroad, who went through the process of giving birth to their own child. And the biggest thing that they mentioned was that I was petrified through the entire process, that I chose not to leave my home for the biggest time, because I was petrified that I would be perceived and read as a pregnant female, right? And the biggest struggle in my life was to be acknowledged and have people treat me as a man, call me as a man, and address me as a man. And I didn't want to give that up just by being perceived as a pregnant female. So this person chose as much as possible to stay within their home during the entire duration of their pregnancy. Now I'd like to share my own experience. I did mention earlier that I was put through invasive ultrasound scans as part of the process of kind of proving my gender, right? Now this was my experience. It was, I feel a little dysphoric sharing this itself, but I'll try to paint a simple picture for you. um, when I went to government, one of the government hospitals to get this process done, right? So just imagine a heavily bearded man walking into the ultrasound room, and there are 10 to 15 pregnant women sitting outside wondering, they're all in very uncomfortable, rightly so, and they're waiting for their turn and annoyed. And then they see this man walking in, and they understand he's not a doctor because he's been escorted by nurses who are giggling, and immediately people want to know why, what happened, and why he gets to go in before us. And the nurses, obviously with no respect to my privacy, go and mutter something. And then these women started giggling, they started clicking my pictures, they start laughing, and they're very, very curious to know what are they going to find, right, in me. And I go into the room, and I don't know if anyone of, might be some of you have gone through ultrasound scans. Ideally, might be a doctor or maximum one or two nurses who are in the room who do this procedure. For my procedure, there were 10 medical students who didn't need to be there. There were some junior doctors. There were many nurses who had no business being there, and they were all there just to watch a show, right? I was treated as an object of ridicule, object of amusement. And I don't know what a procedure that should have ideally taken 5 to 10 minutes at max took 20, 25 minutes. I don't know what they were trying to find. Um, and I felt that my personhood died. I was not a person anymore, right? I was extremely uncomfortable. And the time that I was lying on that bed, I thought of many ways that I wanted to end my life, right? Uh, I wanted to run out of the room. I was looking, I looked whether there was a window in the room that I could jump out of, right? And sorry. So this, and I'm sure I'm not the only one, right? This is just my experience. And this is the experience of a lot of trans masculine people, and might be even worse. Uh, there's also a trans man in India who delayed their transition a lot, their medical transition a lot, because they wanted to have a child of their own, right? And they're a close friend of mine. And he was put through an excruciating ordeal by the IVF clinic, who asked him the most intrusive and inappropriate questions because he presented as a man. Yeah, his gender expression was masculine, right? And they didn't have any business asking those questions as well. And for him, the entire ordeal was so dysphoric because there was no avenue for him to state his chosen name and pronouns, because everything, our information systems, your forms, everything is built towards cisgender women when it comes to pregnancy, right? Now he got so dysphoric that he decided to give up his dream of becoming a parent just because of the system and the behavior of people as part of it. Right now, his suffering is a result of the institutional structures that cannot recognize the possibility that a transgender man can become pregnant. Right, and this sets so many restrictions on transmasculine persons' reproductive choices. Right now, firstly, there is a big lapse, in the hospital or in the information systems in our hospitals, and often the very few trans-friendly hospitals in India even do not account for a man needing services that are traditionally ascribed to female patients. Right, so if a man wants prenatal or postpartum care, if a man needs gynecological services, they often face so many challenges to even book these services, let alone bill these services, because of how the systems are managed and the lack of awareness of the people in the system. Now, insurance service providers is a whole challenge altogether, right? Because obviously insurance service providers see everything in black and white. It's all man, woman, and no one can look at these services in the gray, right? That's a whole challenge altogether. Secondly, an issue is again the information systems lack the capacity to differentiate between the legal name and a chosen name of a patient, right? And hence it becomes extremely difficult and a very dysphoric experience to go to a hospital and seek services when your pronouns are not respected and your chosen name is not respected, because everything goes by your legal ID cards, right? Your Aadhaar and all of that. And a lot of trans people and gender non-binary people do not have adequate ID cards. Now, lastly, it is close to impossible to list yourself as a father on the birth certificate of your child, right? Even if that is your parental identity. Right now, these are just some of the many challenges that transmasculine people face, which I would say restricts them, or which is one of the reasons that they avoid seeking healthcare services, especially sexual and reproductive healthcare. Right, the fear of stigma, the fear of being misgendered, the fear of being mistreated is just many reasons why a lot of transmasculine people don't even explore this way. Now, Aqsa did mention that they're not aware if there is a trans man who has given birth. There are many trans men in India who have children, because these are trans men who have entered in marital relationships with cisgender men, right, and have children as a result of that, right, whether with or without their consent. Now, when these relationships go sour, right, when these trans men decide to come out and live their life authentically, they are often forced to give up the custody of their child, for whom until then they were the primary caregiver, right? And we've seen that the courts, due to their inherent bias towards trans people, often quote the well-being of the child and favor the cisgender uh, partners of these trans men. There have also been instances where the courts um, you know also force the trans people to lose their visitation rights to their children, quoting that it would be traumatizing for their children to view their transmasculine parents post their social and medical transition, right? Now, this is the current scenario. This is the current status in India. And again, I'm not going to repeat, but all the laws, whether it is the abortion law, whether it is the art bill, and the surrogacy bill, which just got passed, I understand, by the Rajya Sabha, none of this includes or addresses transmasculine rights, and I think the broader LGBT community as well now. So, yeah, I'd like to conclude my talk with that, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Vihaan, for your presentation, your personal sharing. I think that really brought the reality to people, that what is the real lived experience. And I think it raised the initial dichotomy that the panel highlights or tries to highlight, that the is there there is in real experiences a choice to be made between either choosing one's gender identity or one's sexual and reproductive rights. And your presentation kind of highlighted that unfair choice to be made. But again, thanks for sharing, and I'm sure there'll be many questions. But I'll move on to Dr. Aparna Chandra.
Thank you, Jayna. Thank you for inviting me to Transform 2021. Um, I should say the joy as well as the challenge of being the last speaker on any panel is that all your prepared remarks just go off out of the window, because many of your previous speakers might have dealt with it. So I'll try as far as possible to not be repetitive, but but I also want to take the opportunity to engage with the comments that have gone before. So oh, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. Um, this is clearly late pandemic symptoms. Um, so my topic and my focus is going to be on the role of the law in both securing, and I should add, in inhibiting reproductive justice for trans persons. And let me begin by exploring this term reproductive justice and the history of this term reproductive justice, how this came into being, because I think that will shed light on the topic. So, reproductive justice was a term that was coined by Black and Indigenous feminists in the US to distinguish their claims and their demands from the reproductive rights movement, which was mainly spearheaded by cishet white women. And which was responsive to their needs. So the reproductive rights movement, particularly in the 1970s in the US, focused on choice. Right, it was about abortion access. It was about not about abortion access. It was about the right to abortion. It was about the right to contraception, and the right basically not to conceive. And the focus was on freedom from state interference in what was seen as a matter of personal choice. And so this was framed as a right to privacy. And if you look at some of the landmark cases of that time, which recognized these rights, the right to contraception or the right to abortion, were couched in the language of privacy, which said that the state should not intervene in these domains. Then that was the focus of the reproductive rights movement. Now, Black and Indigenous feminists contested this framing, and they said that for us, systemic inequality impacts our ability to even make these choices. Right, so these choices are not free choices that we can make outside of the context in which our communities live. So for us, it's not enough for the state to keep away. For us, we need for us to have abortion, access to abortion, or a meaningful right to abortion, is to have access to these services locally and affordably. If we don't have that, then the right to abortion is meaningless for us. So we need the state to intervene. This cannot be a matter of the state keeping away. We need information about these services. We need the state to be providing this information. So for us, these questions of reproductive rights are not only about not having children, but about the context in which the choice to have or to not have children is made. And these contexts are about our community circumstances as well, as much as it is about individual choice. So if I can't afford childcare, then I can't have children. If I don't get pre and postnatal care, then I'm likely to die, because my community is underserved in terms of healthcare, and that is going to shape my choice whether to have children or not. And even the children that I have, I don't get to keep. And this goes to the point that Vihaan was making, and this is Black feminists making the argument, because we are seen as stereotyped as bad mothers, right? So we don't get to keep these children that we want to keep, and that is also an infringement of our reproductive rights. Some of us are forced into sterilization programs because our communities are not valued enough, right? So active eugenics is practiced against us. So our experience of reproductive rights, so say Black and indigenous feminists, so said Black and indigenous feminists, are shaped by the stigma, the exclusion, the discrimination that our communities face. And so, therefore, for us, reproductive rights have no meaning till it is accompanied by social justice. And therefore, bringing together the idea of reproductive rights and social justice, they coined the phrase reproductive justice. So, if we look at the history of this term, right, of looking at reproduction not only as a question of an individual's choice, but as squarely impacted by community circumstances, as having this social element, I think is very, very instructive in then thinking about reproductive justice in the context of trans persons, in the discussion that we are having right now. If you look at Indian law on an Indian constitutional framing of reproductive rights, it's still stuck in that idea of reproductive autonomy, privacy. In any case, the constitution doesn't expressly say anything about this. To the extent that the courts have recognized reproductive rights, by and large, they've recognized it in the context of privacy and autonomy. So very much the 1970s reproductive rights stay away framing when they have talked about questions of reproductive autonomy. So that there is anyway this gap in the understanding of, reproductive rights as requiring something more, and requiring reproductive justice, not just lack of having the state stay away. um there's international language, though, that's more progressive, and that's a space. And I want to just sort of also think about the spaces within the law where there is there's scope for using those spaces for advocacy. The international UN language on reproductive rights does talk about the context of choice, and that's since our jurisprudence is generally more open to international material. That's a space to build out that idea of what reproductive justice really means, generally and particularly for trans persons. A related notion is that of reproductive health. And again, so much of reproductive rights is tied to questions of reproductive health. And this is where courts have actually acknowledged in the Indian context. I'm talking about courts only because my focus is more on laws. So I'm talking about courts and statutory laws, understanding, of course, that whatever the laws might say, what happens on the ground might be completely divorced from what's happening in the statute books. But having said that, our courts have recognized reproductive health as being a wider concept than just choice, right? And individual choice made in the abstract. So the courts have recognized, from taking this from UN language, that sexual and reproductive health is a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being in all matters relating to the reproductive system. And it implies that people have the ability to have satisfying and safe sex lives, the capability to reproduce, and the freedom to decide if, when, and how often to do so. They have the ability to maintain one's sexual and reproductive health, and for that, people need access to accurate information and safe, effective, affordable, and acceptable contraception methods of their choice. They must be empowered and informed to protect themselves from STIs. And when people decide to have children, they should have access to services that can enable them to have healthy pregnancies, safe deliveries, and a healthy child. Right. So this is the language, again, that the UN recognizes on reproductive health, that the courts have recognized. And this is a very interesting case of Devika Biswas where the courts have recognized. I'm not going to go into that, but just to say there's a space here. There's a space to then use this language that courts have already recognized for ongoing advocacy endeavors. Now, again, if we look at this language and then we look at our statutes and our policies, obviously there's a huge disconnect. And that is where I want to focus next, to look at our policies and look at our statutes, to see how they fail to, I should say, recognize this language of reproductive justice and reproductive rights. So for example, if you look at menstruation, and Dr. Aksa spoke about menstruation, the our our policies, and there are court cases on menstruation talking about safe menstruation access, but it's all about women and girls, and the links between access to safe menstruation and menstrual facilities and access to education is all well mapped out in the law, but it is only for women. And so therefore having for example sanitation facilities that are available to other persons who menstruate is just not part of that conversation at all. So it's absolutely absent. And of course the link between having access to safe menstruation, and that's sort of course important in and of itself, but the right to health of persons who menstruate, and including the right to reproductive health of persons who menstruate, is of course very clearly established in practice. Courts have recognized that, but have again just spoken about this as in the context of women and girls. Um, the other thing is with respect to access to information. And again, Dr. Aksa touched upon this, but access to adequate information about safe sexual practices and sexual and reproductive health needs. Now, this is particularly important given that we live in a heteronormative, in a cis heteronormative society. Even though we don't have good comprehensive sexuality education practices generally, at least because we live in a cis heteronormative society, there's some information that is available on heterosexual sexual activities and safe sex practices around that. But there is need for additional advocacy and additional outreach, I should say, community activities and outreach to get this information out, particularly say to trans adolescents who might require this information. However, our laws such as POXO, right, the Protection of Children from Sexual Offences Act, do not recognize sexual activity under the age of 18 as legitimate, right, or legal. And what that means is that if there is community outreach to provide this kind of information, that can be seen as aiding and abetting an offense against POXO, and that has very draconian sentences. And this has been, I mean, it's not just an abstract fear. Definitely in the context of 377, this was the experience of where there were advocacy campaigns around safe sex practices, which were people who were involved in that were then booked under for aiding and abetting an offense under 377. So there is this concern. The other concern is that when sexually active trans adolescent children need to require sexual and reproductive health services, for example contraception or abortion, or if they face sexual violence and require certain health services, POXO mandatorily requires that any person who has information about a sexual offense, and all sexual activity under the age of 18 is a sexual offense, so whether it's by consent or not. So any person who has knowledge has to report it to the police on pain of penalty themselves, and this includes doctors or any other medical healthcare professionals. So now for this trans adolescent person who wants to go to who needs sexual and reproductive health services, they have a choice to access those services only by going through the police criminal justice system. And we know this that the criminal justice system and the policing system, what experience trans persons have of that system. So what chances that a person who is told that the only way you're going to access these services is to go to the police, and we'll have to mandatorily report you, is going to say, yeah, let's go ahead, let's go to the police first, right? And so that becomes a huge site of exclusion. And this is just to say that this kind of thinking of this affirmative actions that the law has to take to make the laws trans inclusive. It's not enough to just step back and say that we won't actively interfere. It's not a question of active interference on part of the state. The state has to affirmatively take steps to ensure that these spaces and these laws rather become trans inclusive. This becomes a huge problem. I've already spoken about menstrual health, but let me talk a little bit about. So this is about menstrual health, about access to information. Let me briefly talk about abortion, and then I'll move to reproductive desire and some of the laws around that. Now, again, everyone here has spoken about how the gender identity and the reproductive desires of a person, of a trans person, are often at odds with each other. And of course, Section 7 of the Transgender Persons Protection of Rights Act is a clear example that you need to have a surgical intervention, or at least a medical intervention, in order to change your gender. But also, because our laws such as the MTP are gender specific, right? You need to be a woman in order to access that law. And if you are not a woman, then the doctor, even if it is a trans affirming doctor, someone who's friendly, is going to think twice about providing that service, because if you do not comply with the terms of the MTP Act, then there are criminal provisions, right? So there are criminal penalties that are attached. So even for someone who is otherwise willing, a doctor who is otherwise willing to provide these services, this is going to be difficult to provide. Um, but that's not the majority of the medical health profession, who are only going to be more than happy to say, use the fact that there is a law as a hope to say, we're not going to provide these services in any case. Now, the Transgender Persons Act says that you cannot be denied medical health services, and there's actually there are some penalties attached to that. But the MTP Act itself gives a way out to doctors from these provisions of the Transgender Persons Act, because it says that these are provisions that can only be provided to women, right? So that's one kind of way in which the gender identity of a transgender person becomes at odd with their ability to decide, for example, to abort or to access abortion services. Moving on to reproductive desires, and again, the previous speakers have all spoken about how very often trans persons are seen as asexual and not reproducing, and so therefore they are completely erased from the legal imagination. Because the law provides legal entitlements or addresses burdens through express categories, this erasure leads to exclusion, right? Because because if there is no express recognition of a person who's going to get some entitlement, or who's entitled to some benefit or some right, then that means that the person is excluded. And that's something that we see in all our laws with respect to reproductive desires. So if you look at adoption laws. Well, if you let me begin with pregnancy more generally. Again, Dr. Aqsa particularly has spoken about the distinctive needs that might be there of trans persons who can become pregnant, but the medical curriculum is often very silent. Now, the Transgender Persons Act has a provision which says that there has to be a reform of medical curriculum to be trans inclusive. Now, that hasn't happened beyond. Dr. Aksa was telling me outside, there's been some geo that has been issued, but beyond that, there's been nothing that has happened. There have been other attempts that have been made, and they can be, again, in building alliances, there can be learnings from some of the other movements where there have been movements within the sexual violence, the groups that work on sexual violence. I know there have been some attempts within LGBT communities, again, cis LGBT communities, opportunities to make some changes in the in medical curriculum, and that's a space. There's now a legal requirement for that to happen, so there's some space of engagement there. On adoption, Dr. Aqsa had put out the adoption guideline that comes under the JJ Act, and I'm just going to take 2 minutes, and then I'll end. In under the JJ Act, if you look at the adoption guidelines, again, Dr. Aqsa had put that up, so you would have seen that there's this requirement that adoptive parents be physically, mentally, and emotionally stable, and you can imagine what kind of stereotypes about transgender persons that operate. And again, Vihaan also spoke about this, that can exclude them at the very threshold from adoption. But again, if you look at who can adopt, then it has to be either, again, within a marital framework, spouses, or a single female or a single male, right? So there is again this dichotomy between for people who've not changed their gender, who are either non-binary or who do not want to change their gender under section 7. There is this entire question of how do you access adoption related rights. The ART and surrogacy bills were passed on December 9th by the Rajya Sabha. I'm sure they'll get presidential assent, and so they are well on their way to becoming the law. But if you look at the ART Act, again, these services can be provided to women and men. It says expressly. Very particularly, it says that doctors cannot transfer an embryo into a male person. What does that mean? How are they defining the category male person? Is going to be, it's again going back to the idea, right? They either have gender identity or have reproductive justice. What does this mean? This is something that we will have to see, and there's, again, I think, a requirement for advocacy on saying, on how you're going to define this provision. I mean, either amend or at least how you're going to define this provision. Surrogacy, of course, is within familial structures. We've moved from compensated to non-compensated, what is called altruistic surrogacy, where the surrogate has to be genetically linked to the intending couple. So anyway, it is within the imagination of a heterosexual marital couple, but even otherwise, there's the requirement of a genetic linkage. Now, again, with trans persons who might otherwise be excluded from their families of birth and have families of choice instead, this requirement that you seek surrogacy services only from someone you are genetically linked with can anyway exclude persons. But then also, of course, it requires you to be in a heterosexual married state to be able to access surrogacy services. So that's an outright exclusion in any case. So just to say that, therefore, all of these laws, because they erase the trans existence, I mean, it's not just even the experience, but trans existence, end up excluding trans persons from these various the entitlement to sort of reproductive services in these various ways, from pregnancy to abortion to adoption to ART to surrogacy, or to access to sexual reproductive health services and rights. So there's a huge disconnect between what the Constitution says and what the laws are saying, and that's space where advocacy can therefore happen, because there is some language, there is some hopeful language from the courts. There's space for advocacy to happen, but those are the challenges that I see. At, yeah, thanks. Right now, with the way that the law is framed, I'll stop here and happy to take questions.
Thank you, Aparna. Thank you for raising or framing the the framework of reproductive justice as being different from just reproductive rights, and for laying that out. Where did reproductive justice stem from? And what it adds to just seeking reproductive rights, and looking at some of the legislation and the MTP Act, the Surrogacy Act, and some of these new debates. So I think we've had a great panel. We've had many important themes arising on recognition of reproductive and sexual health issues of trans persons, ranging from access to reproductive and sexual health care, and gynecological scans and tests for trans persons, the right to the issues around the right to have children and the right to parent, and how that can be thought through in the context of the trans community, issues around the Trans Persons Act and how it completely excludes reproductive and sexual health access. The need to link the right to gender identity to include reproductive choices, and it cannot be an either or. One right cannot take away the other right. And really, I think it highlights the need for both the reproductive rights or reproductive justice movements, which have been women's groups working on these issues, and the trans rights and intersex rights movements to really work together on many of these, and of course the medical community to kind of work on these themes. So many ideas to go forward, a lot of law reform issues, but yeah, lots of great ideas to go forward. So we'll open out the floor for questions. We have around maybe 10 to 15 minutes. But yeah, can I take a few, 3 or 4 questions together and maybe have the panel? There's Kanmani, VQ, there's another person there. So maybe we'll take these 3.
What feudal person are you?
Okay, fine. So, no, I don't know if it's a valid question, but I was thinking about it when Aqsa Mama and Vihaan and everyone speaking. Um, when I was in DU and there was this election issue, student union election issue of trying to fight for sanitary pad vending machines in washrooms, in female washrooms. And when I raised the issue that it should be also in the male washrooms, the fact that trans persons can actually come to the university and use a sanitary pad vending machine, it was just alien to people. And eventually, of course, the person who won never installed the machine, as usual. So I'm just like wondering if that is also a part of sexual and reproductive rights in terms of accessing universities, because I've seen so many even cis women friends struggling to access university spaces and going through very difficult times just because there's not a sanitary pad available immediately. So I'm sure that happens even with trans persons. So I'm just wondering, yeah.
Thanks. So I want to kind of ask 2 broad, maybe 3 broad things. One is that I'm wondering, how do we have this conversation? In some sense, Aparna's presentation does push us there. How do we have this conversation without actually talking about criminal law, which fundamentally frames the conversation on sexuality as such, right? And so, I mean, I just can't seem to, I can't have this conversation if the rape laws in this country continue to frame the conversation in terms of penis and vaginas, right? And so, and that's the framing of so many of these other uh, rights-based laws that are actually providing services and so on and so forth, right? Because violation is constantly haunting the scene, especially institutional violation, which actually strangely has a lot of impunity, right? We know that rapes in hospitals are actually one of the least convictions, asylums, sterilization clinics, so on and so forth. So on the one hand, you have institutional impunity. On the other hand, you have a kind of carceral system that frames sexuality, whether POXO, whether Devdasi Act, whether trafficking laws, whether and so on and so forth, abortion and so on, and especially rape laws. And then, of course, you have this conversation about rights. And I'm wondering if we want to put the 3 things together, especially because we know the largest violation of sexual and reproductive rights actually happens in institutional context. The second thing I want to kind of provoke in the reproductive rights, reproductive justice conversation is that one of the most important contexts of that conversation is slavery, right? The fact that black women actually do not have reproductive, not just autonomy, any control over their reproductive capacities, right? White men have impunity to rape black women for centuries now, and that's why at the heydays of the reproductive rights movement, Toni Morrison wrote the book called Beloved, in which the black mother actually kills her own child in order to protect her from entering slavery. So, how do we, in a similar way, how do we have a conversation here about reproductive rights or reproductive justice without actually having a conversation about the caste economy within which we function? The reason why a lot of trans women, and I can speak from that context at least, have fucked up sexual health and reproductive health is precisely because of the context in which they work, which is it. Given that the only option is sex work and begging, given that I mean, whatever the great policing around their bodies and so on and so forth. And I know a lot of working class trans men work in very unhealthy factory conditions, right? And so, how do we have this conversation without actually fronting, in some sense, the political economy of this? And my final kind of provocation, I'm leaving the three to anyone who wants to say anything, is the all the other parenting trans people do, right? I'm just the number of children that trans people like who cross 18 suddenly have. They're providing them hormones. They're looking after them. They're providing care work and so on. They're providing them love and compassion and all the things that. And what that is important for me is that do we want to necessarily go through the good parent argument, which I see often a lot of us make, which is that we can also be good parents, right? And I think that, I mean, in some sense, actually, we are fine being like really fucked up bad parents who police and so on and so forth. One of the kind of great impulse in the reproductive justice argument is precisely to step away from like how I parent my child, right? Because of the great kind of carceral and police context in which parenting actually happens. And if in this context, trans people who are constantly policed in a social context are raising children, then the good parent, bad parent argument is a trap. And it, of course, completely sidelines the fact that trans people have been raising other trans people for generations now. And that other bit where we actually have experience where adult parents desert their children and we take up adult children and raise them is an important argument about reproductive justice, because if reproductive justice is greater than simply birthing children, but about the reproductive labor that goes in raising and keeping them alive.
Thank you. And yeah.
I would just like to share my thoughts. You can consider it as questions or just thoughts. First thing which I want to highlight over here is when are we talking about all these things outside this conference? So we are just having these conferences and discussing things, but when are we taking this outside? So that was my first thought which came to my mind while I was listening to all the speakers. And then I think so. Education is the key. It has always remained the key. So that's there. And apart from that, mm, how will we reach the poorest of poor in the community? That's still a big question mark. Or are we just coming here, meeting here for say a period of 2-3 hours and then just going back to our lives? So what about, recently I had a conversation with a ace friend who is, from the rural background, and she is married, and daily, in the sense, she is forced upon by her husband. She is an apathy sexual, means she's sex repulsed, but still, but still she cannot do anything about it. She comes from such a background. So are we just, you know, we are not seeing we are just concentrating on the tip of the iceberg, is what my question was. And then apart from that, how will the legal fraternity or the how will you teach the other people? Because here I can see very less from the, less members who have gathered here. So how are you, how will you educate them? So uh, it's just a small suggestion, giving them case vignettes and then trying to test what is their level of education, how will they handle it if such a case comes to their hand, is what you all have to do, is my suggestion. Though you may discuss on that, please correct me if I'm wrong. And then the last one would be, what is the role of CLPR, or what is it doing, or what has it planned about the recent judgment, which denies the adoption, this and also what is the role of CLPR? Is there anything which they have planned? So these were my thoughts. Thank
Yeah.
you.
Okay. Shall we take a round of responses, maybe?
Yeah, so I think that's a very valid question, right? And I know I can speak from my own experience with the work that I do in the diversity and inclusion space within corporates. That's a constant dialogue we have. We've made provisions for gender neutral washrooms almost in every floor, and also policies that kind of dictate that a person can use the washroom of their choice in line with their identity, right? And that everyone has to respect that, and hence. But something that came up on back of that was that we made sanitary, napkin machines, vending machines available in the women's washroom and the gender neutral washrooms. But then there was a trans masculine person who came and said that I use the men's washroom. So what are you kind of mandating that I need to use the gender neutral washroom in order to have access to that, right? So very relevant question. So but so in the corporate space, I think there is, again, because there's a lot of global mandates and conversations around soji and inclusion, there's a space to kind of address it, right? And people are more supportive. But when it comes to universities, where even having vending machines within the women's washroom is such a concern, and it's not kind of, to your point, someone won and they didn't even do it, right? And I'm hoping, was that a cis woman who won, or no? Cis man, okay. So, okay, but so it becomes very difficult, right? And I think I to be very honest, I don't have an answer to it, but it's just, I would see, having the dialogue, keeping on having the dialogue, and being able to influence people around you, having them influence people around them, and I think increasing voices about it and kind of putting pressure on faculties, because to the point over there saying, we can't do something to a large impact. One person, I don't think a lot of us can do that. Even in the transgender movement, there's a lot of questions asked, what did you do, what did you do? If we all had that kind of power, none of these laws would be in place, right? But it's about having dialogues, consistent dialogues, right, in whatever shape or form, in whatever space, and being able to influence people in authorities in whatever shape or form. So even if it's whether with the grassroots movements, with the people who work on the grassroots, the community members, something that we've done in Kerala is work very closely with Kudumbashri, right, the local self-governance framework, which is able to make, I think, changes on the ground, right? So to the point of, we've even created, so we worked very closely with Center for Development Studies. We did a roundtable where we invited panchayat leaders, right? And we came up with a handbook on LGBT inclusion, which even lists out Malayalam vocabulary for LGBT, right? Which people don't know, which even any person would understand, right? And what we did was work with the the state planning board. We invited the chairperson from there and told them to, and this is a very this doesn't take much budget, right? So what they did was they commissioned the production of these. It's a 34-page book, right? And to make it available widely, right? So if you're sitting in a public library or in a government hospital, this book is there on the table along with newspapers and magazines, so anyone can take it and read. And what we told them was also to commission the panchayats to deliver it to the house residences in their ward, right? So it also lists out all the community based organizations in Kerala, the contact persons, so that even if parents might not reach out, the children in that house, while they grow up and don't know and are fearing for their life or facing some kind of violence and want to run out or reach out to someone, can pick up one of those contact numbers and call, right? Because many a time, even if the states come up with a helpline for trans people, it doesn't work, no one picks up, right? So what are other ways in which we can kind of create systems, ecosystems, which can help LGBT people or trans people from all diverse backgrounds, right? Because we do recognize that there are people from socioeconomical backward classes as well who might not have that education as well, right? But I think it is an ongoing process. We are nowhere where we need to reach, but I think it's just important that we keep having conversations. Having this conversation here itself was great, right? I mean, the amount of information or the how much I got educated by Aqsa's presentation, I can't. I mean, so thank you for that. But I mean, for me is the task for me is again to take that away and share with as many people as I can, right? And I think that would also be something that I'd request everyone to do. I did want to just reflect upon Viku's very well observed thought about parenting, right? And something and this is something I know a lot of trans people resonate with, is that I'm 36 years old, right? And I have a biologist. I'm one of those privileged people who have the support and love of my biological family, and I have a chosen family also. I have a chosen mother. I have 8 sisters. We were actually 10. I lost one chosen sister to suicide earlier this year, and I'm their only brother, right? Now a lot of people ask me, you have your biological family, then why do you have a chosen family, right? I have 2 biological sisters as well, right? So a lot of women in my life. So and I absolutely love it. So but the question, and I often tell them, is that what you don't, the experiences you don't learn from a biological family, right? The lessons you never, or the insights you never get to hear from your biological parents, that is what you get from your chosen family, right? And I would I would say that I'm a much better person every day because of my interactions and the love and experiences that I share with my chosen family. And I am so my chosen sisters have children, right, from the community. So I'm an uncle, right? And then much of my nieces and nephews are older than me also, by the way. So so we try to keep that relationship, but the fact being that there are not a lot of elderly trans people, because a lot of people pass away. I don't, there are very few people we can look at who are above 50s, right? So that kind of makes us grandparents, grand uncles, and uncles and parents at a very young age, right? And but rightly so, to your point, that we can't discount parenting there, and that is also one way of looking at it. I'm at a loss of words. I don't know how to even start to bring in this conversation in the system of where it is discussed about what is good parenting and how we've been assessed as to get a certificate for being a good parent. In that case, I should be the greatest parent in India, with the with the amount of parenting and the guidance and the kind of mentorship that we've done within the trans community and the members that we who are our families. I don't think that's helpful, but I just wanted to share my thoughts there.
Okay, so just to add to that point of putting sanitary napkins in men's washroom, is that heavens are not going to fall if we put a product there which you don't need. You can always take back a few home and give it to your wives or daughters and gift them and learn more about women's health. Maybe I'm giving an idea, maybe put some female condoms in men's washroom and men's condom in females washroom, and they can all use it, right? I mean, so it's not like you have to use the product. You can always take home and gift it to others. So similarly, sanitary napkins can also be there in men's washroom. Adding to that point on biological family versus chosen family, I think there is this battle that we are having with the law and with the state in terms of allowing us to have us both the biological family as well as the chosen family. So the trans act is an assault on even the chosen family, whether you are able to even exercise that with the trans children. So I think we need to fight both the battles, the right to have the chosen as well as the biological family. And I think it would be unfair to tell to trans persons that the chosen families are sufficient for you and therefore shouldn't aspire for biological family. Why not? I mean, if someone wants it, they should have the right to have it. I mean, after all, this is your country also. um, Coming to very valid suggestions from Fatma. Fatma mentioned about, we should also be speaking about non-elitist demands from the poorest of the poor queer persons. And yesterday, I'm very happy to share that we had these conversations, for example, on how some of the elite queer and lesbian couples are fighting for right to marriage during the times of the pandemics, when some poor trans persons are finding it hard to survive. And we really need to question ourselves as to what are our priorities. So we had that conversation. Sayan also talked about the needs of the elderly trans persons and how the state also refuses to take care of them. So we have been having that conversations. And I think though we are only 40-50 persons in this hall right now who are having this conversation, I'm sure each of us has a lot of groups, networks, communications where we can take back these conversations and have it in those extended settings. And I think apart from all the labor and the work that we do in terms of fighting for our rights, it's also very important to enjoy these places, safe spaces where we can be ourselves. Because ultimately, it may sound a little selfish, but I have to survive first to fight for the rights of my community. And I think coming to these kind of conferences and having the space and having you all is an act in survival for me, and I'm sure it must be for a lot of other persons. So we need to value these spaces, these conversations, these opportunities, even if we are just 40-50, but also use this platform and the privilege that we have to take these conversations back to the larger community. And I'll give the mic to you to answer VQ's question there.
I actually just want to answer, say something about that question on sanitary napkins. Um, the UGC actually has rules, and I'm sorry to be the law person on the panel who keeps talking about the law as if the law mm, on the books in itself matters, but there is a space there for advocacy, right? So the UGC does have regulations on providing gender neutral facilities for trans persons observed in breach, of course. And I was reading somewhere there's a new report out which looks even at just national law schools to see how all of them are in absolute breach of all the UGC requirements. But having said that, there are these specific regulations. They don't, to the best of my knowledge, it's been some time since I read that, but to the best of my knowledge, they don't talk expressly about sanitary pads or other products. But because there is that space, I think there are also good general principles there. So there's space for advocacy there. Onto the question of the link between sexual autonomy and reproductive justice, obviously, right? Where there is a denial of sexual autonomy, there can't be reproductive justice. POXO, of course, is an example of that. Slavery and forced sterilization, forced impregnation is obviously an example of that. So the reproductive justice builds on some notion of sexual autonomy, and if that's not present, and so I think that both your questions are linked in that sense, that when you're looking at slavery, if you're looking at the caste economy, the political economy of caste and reproductive justice, injustice, none of that makes sense without thinking through very carefully the question of sexual autonomy and the role that the law has in both in permitting certain kinds of sexual formations and not others. um, to the question of parenting, I think I completely agree with the impulse that you have. And just to add to that, to say that the law is built upon the normativity of the biological family, right? And not just with respect to, I mean, it's everywhere. If you look at any family law, if you look at inheritance, if you look at just the assumption of who gives you who's your next of kin in emergency situations, who can take medical decisions for you, who can be on your insurance, all of that is built on the idea of the biological family. And therefore bringing in families of choice is a very, very important conversation to have, or to have other kinds of close relations, intimate relations and close relations, non-normative familial structures, non-normative intimate relations is something that's incredibly important for a, I mean, that's reimagining, I think, a fundamental element of the law itself, apart from the fundamental element of the societal structure upon which the law is built. And that's very much required. But I think I would also, I mean, my initial thought was also along the lines that Dr. Aqsa mentioned, which is to say that which is not to say that biological families, or families that are I mean, adoptive families are in that sense not biological, but biological families are not important. And that for people who have that the impulse to have biological children, that somehow that should be that desire should somehow, and I don't mean to say that that's what you were suggesting, but that's a very crucial element of something that's worth preserving and something that's worth protecting in how we imagine the law. So they're not necessarily either or conversations. I think that both the conversations value.
The family act itself rests on fiction, right?
Yeah.
And so there is actually no real distinction between a chosen family and a
Yeah.
biological family, and everyone actually chooses to be with
Yeah.
family. And so in that way, I think we have to let go of the fiction of the biological family, because that is at the heart of all the other normativities tied to surrogacy and
Right.
so on and so forth.
Right, absolutely. And just as a last point on the conference versus community, I don't think that's necessarily dichotomous, that there's conference and there's community. Conference is where you create also knowledge and solidarity, and then you take that to the community. When, what do you take to the community? You take things that information and knowledge that you build in spaces like this. So I don't personally don't think that there's a dichotomous relationship between conference and community activism. Sure, sure, sure. Sure, and there should be both a two-way traffic.
I think we're way out of time. I know there are a couple of hands, but I will request if you can discuss it during the tea break, only because this has been such an exciting session that we've also overstretched, but it was worth it. So I request you to, do it over the tea break. But I think we've got some great suggestions. I think the issue of sanitary napkins in all washrooms, there's no harm, right? Whether people use it or not. I think specifically with Aparna being at NLS, we can see to it that they can start there and see how that experience goes. But thanks for all the great conversations. I think thanks, Vicky, for bringing the issue of rape laws within this conversation, because it's an important part of addressing sexual and reproductive rights. So with that, we end. Thank you so much for a fabulous conversation, to my amazing speakers. And we'll break for tea. Thank you.
I know.